The whip cracked across his back. "Move faster, worm." Alex kept his head down, cataloging the brutal calculus of survival. The Emperor demanded more thorium, more bodies. Then the sky turned black. A Hellwalker descended, threatening to erase them all. Desperate, he led his sister into forbidden tunnels. What they found there would change everything. Alex's world was the dust. Each breath in the Syria pits tasted of it, gritty, metallic, punishing. With his sister Mira beside him, he swung the heavy pick into the rock face, the rhythm harsh but necessary. Their lives were tallied not in days, but in thorium quotas. The Empire watched, and the Overseer's whip was its voice. Every day blurred into the next. Exhaustion, pain, and the slow wearing down of hope. That morning began the same. A sharp crack of the lash, a grunt from a man nearby. Mira's knuckles were raw, her eyes hollow in the low light. Then came the Overseer's cry from the ridge above. "Quota raised!" 50 more pounds per crew by sundown. A ripple of despair moved through the slaves. It was impossible. Alex felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He kept his head low, made himself small. Invisibility was a skill. It kept you alive. Hunger lived in his belly like a second heart beating constantly. Fear tasted like rust on his tongue. Alex learned young how to read the Overseers, the ones who liked causing pain, the ones who could be distracted. He watched their patterns when they patrolled, when they grew bored or careless. A single wrong glance could earn you a broken bone, a night in the cages, or a trip to the reclamation pits. You learned to measure risk like you measured thorium, by weight, by consequence. The Qatar did not see them as human. Slaves were assets, expendable. Their labor fueled the war fleet, ship after ship built on their broken backs. This knowledge settled in Alex like a stone, but it also hardened him. Survival here demanded more than strength. It required patience, calculation, a quiet kind of defiance. The desert itself was a prison, walls of sand and sky. The heat by day could burn skin. The cold by night bit deep. Men sometimes just sat down and never got back up. The moral decay was quieter, a slow surrender in the eyes of those who had been there too long. You forgot what it was to be free. You remembered only the work, the pain, the dust. Then Alex noticed it. A shift in the light, a strange quiet falling over the pit. He lifted his eyes. To the east, the horizon was no longer sharp. It swam, blurred, darkened. A deep hum vibrated through the ground, up through the soles of his worn boots. The other slaves paused, tools falling silent. The Overseers began shouting, their voices edged with something new. Not anger, alarm. The sky deepened from pale blue to a bruised, churning black. It moved toward them, swallowing the sun. This was no dust storm. This was the Hellwalker. It came without warning, a wall of obliteration. It meant death for anything caught in the open. Alex's calculations changed instantly. Survival was no longer about quotas. It was about seconds. He grabbed Mira's arm, his mind already turning toward the one place they were forbidden to go. The tunnels. The horizon disappeared, not by fading but by being devoured. The sandstorm didn't just approach, it consumed a wall of swirling darkness taller than the canyon rims. Alex knew. He had heard the stories from old miners who never looked at the eastern sky the same way again. This was no seasonal dust storm from the Syria flats. This was the Hellwalker. It didn't just blind you. It scoured flesh from bone, erased anything living from the open desert. The Overseer's whistles shrieked now, urgent and panicked. Orders to take cover. But there was no cover. The slave pits were a death trap. He locked his hand around Mira's thin wrist. The wind was already a roar, pulling at their rags, whipping sand and stinging clouds. He had to shout directly into her ear, his voice raw. The tunnels. The old way down. Her eyes widened in pure fear. Not of the storm, but of his suggestion. Those tunnels were forbidden for a reason. The Overseers told stories of collapses, of miners who ventured in and never came out. Some whispered worse things, that the tunnels were haunted by the ghosts of the first colonists, that they whispered madness to those who entered. Going in meant a beating or worse if you were caught, but staying meant being caught by the Hellwalker. That was a death with no if about it. The choice was simple, a possible death underground or a certain one here. They broke from the panicked crowd, ducking low against the gale. Alex led them along a rock face he had mapped in his mind over countless shifts, a path hidden by a fallen drill rig. The entrance was a jagged crack in the stone, half blocked by rubble. It looked like a tomb entrance. They squeezed through as the world turned to chaos behind them. The light died. Sound became a physical thing, a deafening scream of wind and sand. The air thickened until it was hard to breathe, each gasp full of grit. Inside the tunnel, the world didn't get quieter. The Hellwalkers' fury translated through the rock. The ground trembled under their feet. A deep, grinding vibration shook dust and pebbles from the ceiling. They stumbled forward into a blackness so complete it felt solid. Alex kept one hand on the wall, the other gripping Mira's arm. The tunnel sloped down, the air growing cooler, smelling of ancient stone and damp. The roaring above them muted to a low, threatening hum. But the danger wasn't over. The shaking intensified. A rock the size of his head crashed down inches away, shattering on the ground. Another struck his shoulder, a glancing blow that sent a spike of pain down his arm. He pushed Mira ahead of him, his own body between her and the falling debris. They were running blind into a maze of unknown dangers, driven by a desperation that left no room for second thoughts. The floor was uneven, littered with loose rock. He focused on the feel of it under his boots, on the sound of Mira's ragged breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other. Then the stone beneath his left foot wasn't stone at all. It was nothing. A section of the floor, weakened by the vibrations, gave way completely. There was no time to cry out. His balance vanished. He fell through empty black air, the world disappearing into a silent void. The fall ended with a jarring impact, but not the sharp crack of broken bone. He landed on a surface unnaturally flat and cold. It felt like polished stone, but hummed faintly. He pushed himself up, his hands registering the smooth, seamless texture, completely alien after a lifetime of Syria's ragged rock. The blackness around him was total, a pressing silence broken only by his own breathing and a faint, distant thrum from deep within the structure. Then a light bloomed, a soft, cool blue. It pulsed once from a narrow band along the curving wall, then again like a slow, steady heartbeat. With each pulse, the light traveled further, revealing more. The chamber was circular, the walls and ceiling flowing together in one continuous, perfect curve. They weren't rock. They were a dark, gunmetal gray alloy, seamless and impossibly smooth. At the center of the room, a single chair rose from the floor on a low dais. It was clearly a command chair, wide and solid, surrounded by a horseshoe of dormant control panels. The air itself felt different. It was still, but thrumming with a latent energy that raised the hair on his arms. It was an old energy, deep and patient, but also sharp, advanced. The symbols etched into the consoles and walls glowed with the same soft blue light. Geometric shapes and flowing scripts he had never seen in any car archive. Alex stood, his body aching from the fall, his mind struggling to process the impossible geometry of the place. A voice cut through the silence, clear and devoid of any emotion. It came from everywhere and nowhere. DNA analysis in progress. A globe of shimmering light materialized above the central console, a complex web of lines and symbols rotating slowly in the air. He heard a scrabbling sound from above. Mira's face appeared in the hole he had fallen through, her eyes wide with fear. "Alex," she called down, her voice tight. He moved under the opening, holding up his arms. "Jump! I'll catch you!" She dropped, and he managed to break her fall, stumbling back against the smooth wall. She gripped his arm, her gaze sweeping the chamber, her fear morphing into pure astonishment. They stood together, two slaves coated in desert grime, in the center of a room that defied every law of their world. The hum in the air grew slightly louder. The blue light from the wall seemed to intensify, focusing on them. The holographic display flickered, the lines within it rearranging into a new, more complex pattern. This was not a core mining outpost. This was not a forgotten tomb. The sheer scale of the technology, the clean power of it, was centuries beyond anything the Empire possessed. They had not found a refuge. They had found a relic, and it was waking up. It saw them. The mechanical voice spoke again, its tone shifting, the cadence becoming almost deliberate. "Solaris lineage verified." The voice changed. The flat mechanical tone softened, taking on a quality that felt almost like recognition. The words that followed struck the air with a quiet finality. "Solaris lineage verified. Welcome, descendant of Admiral Darius Solaris." The name meant nothing. It was a sound, an empty title. Alex's life was built on simpler truths. The weight of a pickaxe, the sting of the lash, the gnawing hunger in his belly. He was a miner, slave, nothing more. His history began in the dust of the Saria pits, a story written in scars and survival. Admirals belonged to the old tales, ghost stories whispered in the dark about a time before chains, a civilization that had fallen and left them to this. The system continued, its voice a calm river against the storm in his mind, commander of the Third Fleet of the Human Confederation. Each word was a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading through the chamber and through him. The Human Confederation. That phrase did hold weight. It was the name of the before time, the lost civilization the car had crushed and erased 3 centuries ago. The history they taught said all human leadership had been purged, wiped from the galaxy, their legacy nothing but ash and forgotten ruins. But this machine, this impossible piece of the past, was claiming he carried the blood of those legends. It wasn't just saying he was related to them. It was saying he was a direct heir, the last link in a chain he never knew existed. He looked at his hands, at the calluses and grime ground deep into his skin. These were a slave's hands, not an admiral's. He felt Mira's stare before he turned to meet it. Her face, usually a mask of shared exhaustion, was wide with a new, unreadable expression. It wasn't just shock. It was a dawning realization, a shifting of the entire world. In her eyes, he wasn't just her brother, the cautious survivor who kept them both alive. He was suddenly something else, a possibility. A key to a door they never knew was locked. A heavy pressure settled on his shoulders. It was a physical sensation, like a weighty cloak being draped over him, woven from generations he had never known. It was the weight of a name, a legacy, a command he never asked for and didn't understand. His identity, a thing he had held onto so fiercely in the pits, fractured and reformed in the space of a single breath. He was no longer just Alex the slave. The machine had named him something else, a descendant, an heir, but inheritance is not a gift. It is a transaction. It came with a price, with duties and expectations he couldn't even begin to fathom. Freedom was the dream that had kept him breathing all these years. This felt like the opposite. It felt like a new kind of chain, forged from history and obligation, and it was locking into place around him. The voice had said welcome back, but he had never been here before. He was stepping into a role meant for a dead man, a legend with only the instincts of a survivor to guide him. The potential for change was immense, a terrifying abyss opening at his feet. The voice identified itself. Argus, Artificial Responsive Guidance Utility System. It stated this not as an introduction but a simple fact, a piece of data in a stream of cold assessment. Alex's eyes traveled the chamber again, seeing it with new understanding. This was not a simple room. It was the command deck, the nerve center of a ship. Not a transport, not a freighter, a battle cruiser. The holographic display now showed a schematic of a vessel with sharp, aggressive lines designated Phoenix-class Invictus. The name hung in the air, a word from a history book that had been burned. He knew the stories. Every slave did in whispers. The Confederate Third Fleet, their last greatest stand. They were said to have fought to the last ship, buying time for civilian transports to escape the car advance. Their sacrifice was a monument, a tragedy. But the stories always ended the same way. They were lost, wiped out, destroyed to the last hull. This machine was calmly telling him that one of those legends was buried around him, its heart still beating. Argus explained the ship's condition with a dispassionate clarity. After a catastrophic engagement known as the Battle of Zira, the Invictus was crippled. Its commanding officer, the Admiral whose blood now ran in Alex's veins, had initiated an emergency protocol. Not retreat, not scuttling. Burial. They had driven the ship into the desert crust of this moon, hiding it from the victorious car fleet, preserving it. For what, the AI did not say. The cost of that survival was immense. Argus reported current status. Main systems at 22% operational capacity. Primary and secondary weapons arrays, offline. Propulsion systems, severely damaged. Life support functioned at a minimal level, explaining the stale but breathable air. The ship was alive, but only just. A great beast in a deep, wounded sleep. The paradox of it settled over Alex like a physical weight. The Invictus was a thing of breathtaking power. Its technology, even damaged, was a light in the overwhelming dark of car dominance. It was hope given physical form. But it was also a trap, a beacon. If the car discovered it, they would stop at nothing to claim it, to dissect its secrets, to turn its ghost into a weapon for their own fleet. and they would kill everyone who had ever laid eyes on it. This lifeline was also a death sentence waiting to be delivered. He looked at Mira. She gripped the back of the command chair, her knuckles white. They were two slaves covered in the grit of the pit, standing in the heart of a myth. They held a power they couldn't possibly wield, a key to a lock they didn't know how to turn. The sheer scope of it was dizzying. The responsibility was a cold stone in his gut. They had found a sword, but it was too heavy to lift. Then the moment of awe shattered. Argus's voice resumed, its tone unchanged by the gravity of its words. It detected a core patrol. They had followed the energy signature from the initial system's wake-up. Or perhaps they were simply sweeping the tunnels after the Hellwalker. The reason didn't matter. The result did. They were converging on this location. Their estimated time of arrival was 43 minutes. The first true test had arrived before they had even finished understanding what they had found. The clock was now the loudest thing in the room. Argus displayed the two options on the main hologram. The first glowed a solid, aggressive red. A schematic of the ship appeared, with defensive fields activating around it. Weapons systems, those few that were still online, powering up. The AI's voice was a flat, analytical stream. Full activation of defensive systems. Establish a hardened perimeter. The Invictus would announce its presence with overwhelming force. It would fight. The second option shimmered a faint, uncertain blue. The schematic changed. The ship's energy signature diminished to a near imperceptible flicker. External emissions ceased. The plan was to become a ghost. To make the car scanners see nothing but rock and empty tunnel. Emergency stealth protocols. The oldest systems on the ship, the least maintained. Then came the numbers. They appeared beside each option, cold and absolute. The stealth system was degraded from centuries of disuse and damage from the burial impact. Its probability of successfully concealing the massive battlecruiser from a focused Quar patrol scan was calculated at 43%. It was a coin toss. A very bad coin toss. The defensive capability analysis was more promising but carried a different kind of weight. The point defense turrets that were still functional, combined with the durable armor plating, gave a 78% probability of repelling the initial search party. The math was clear. Fighting gave them a much better chance of surviving the next hour. But survival was no longer a simple matter of living through the day. Alex looked from the red option to the blue, understanding the true cost embedded in each percentage point. Choosing defense meant a spectacular, violent announcement. The car would see the energy signatures, the weapon discharges. They would know without a doubt that something of immense power was hidden here. They would not send another patrol. They would send a battalion, a fleet. The existence of the Invictus, humanity's greatest secret, would be revealed to the very empire that had spent 300 years hunting for any remnant of the Confederation. Choosing stealth was a gamble on silence. It meant trusting ancient, failing technology to hide them. A 43% chance they would remain a secret. A 57% chance the car scanners would penetrate the field, find them completely vulnerable, and take the ship without a fight. They would be captured or killed, and the Invictus would become the final, terrible weapon in the car arsenal. Alex had spent his entire life making small calculations. Which overseer to avoid, how to hide an extra nutrient bar, when to keep his head down. The stakes were always his life or Mira's. The consequences of a mistake were personal, contained. This was different. This decision would echo. It would determine the fate of the ship, its technology, and the flicker of hope it represented for every human still living under the car boot. The responsibility was a physical pressure, a constriction in his chest. He was not a military strategist. He was a miner. Yet the command chair waited. The legacy of the Admiral was a silent demand. Leadership, he realized in that moment, was not about choosing the right path. It was about choosing a path when every option was a form of failure. It was about evaluating which terrible outcome you could live with, and which one you could not. The holographic timer in the center of the display updated. The numbers shifted down by 1. 42 minutes. The car were coming. The ship was quiet, waiting for his order. The weight of the choice was his alone. While Alex stood frozen before the holographic choice, a different kind of decision was being forced elsewhere in the tunnel network. Subcommander Vexcar led his patrol with the bored confidence of a man hunting rats. Their orders were simple. Sweep the old tunnels after the storm. Look for deserters. Look for salvage. This was a punishment detail, far from the comforts of the main garrison. The tunnels were dark, unstable, and according to superstition, cursed. Vexcar wasn't superstitious. He was annoyed. His point soldier stopped short. The man raised a hand, his posture shifting from bored to alert. The tunnel ahead was blocked. Not by a rockfall. A wall of shimmering, translucent energy cut across the passage, humming with a low, resonant frequency. It cast a pale blue light on the rough stone walls. Vexcar stepped forward, his brow furrowed. This was no natural formation. It wasn't car tech either. Their barrier projectors were bulky, noisy things that emitted a harsh orange field. This was something else, clean, silent, unnerving. He motioned to his weapons specialist. The soldier raised his disruptor rifle, set it to maximum burn, and fired. A bolt of concentrated energy, capable of punching through light armor, lanced across the tunnel. It struck the shimmering wall and vanished. There was no explosion, no ripple. The energy was simply absorbed, swallowed without a trace. The wall remained unchanging. A cold knot of unease tightened in Vexcar's stomach. This was wrong. Then the spheres appeared. A dozen of them, no larger than a man's fist, emerged from the darkness beyond the barrier. They were made of the same dark, polished alloy as the walls of the Invictus, moving with a silent, impossible grace. They floated through the energy field as if it weren't there, and began to orbit the car soldiers. They moved too fast to track, weaving intricate patterns around the stunned men. The soldiers shuffled back, raising their weapons, but there was nothing to aim at. The spheres were a blur, a voice spoke. It had no discernible source. It seemed to come from the air itself, from the rock walls, from inside their own helmets. It was calm, genderless, and carried a tone of absolute authority. Warning: you have entered a restricted zone under the protection of the Human Confederation. Leave immediately. Vexcar opened his mouth to bark an order, to tell his men to fire at will. The words never left his lips. The orbiting spheres pulsed. There was no sound, only a sudden, blinding flash of white light that filled the tunnel. It wasn't light that burned the eyes. It was light that struck the nervous system. Every car soldier stiffened, muscles locking. Their weapons clattered to the stone floor. Then they followed, collapsing in a heap of paralyzed bodies. They were conscious. Their eyes were open, staring, but they could not move a single muscle. They were prisoners of their own flesh. The event was over in seconds. The energy barrier remained. The spheres returned to their silent patrol beyond it. The demonstration was complete. This was the core of the car's deepest, most classified fear. They had built an empire on stolen, reverse-engineered fragments of Confederate technology. They understood its principles enough to misuse them, but never to master them. They feared finding intact systems because they knew, on some level, they were still inferior. They were children playing with a dead god's weapons, and here was proof the god was not entirely dead. The technology could think. It could judge. It could act on its own. On the bridge of the Invictus, Argus updated the tactical display. The car patrol's biosigns were still present, but they were now static, non-threatening. The immediate local threat was neutralized. But the AI also registered the powerful automated comms burst the defensive system had sent the moment it engaged. A priority alert. A report of hostile contact with unknown advanced technology. It was a signal that would be picked up by the nearest Quar command hub. The clock Argus had given Alex was wrong. They had less time, much less. The car response would not be another patrol. It would be something far worse. The holographic countdown glowed. 39 minutes. Fighting meant revealing their only hope. Hiding meant likely capture. Alex stared at the displays, his mind working past the fear, hunting for a third option. Their only real advantage wasn't the ship's damaged guns. It was the technology itself, its ability to interface, to mimic, to deceive. He turned to the patient, glowing orb of Argus. "Can you send a message?" he asked, his voice low. "That looks like it comes from them?" "From Car Command?" The plan took shape in fractured pieces, built on a foundation of desperation. They would use the Invictus's advanced comm systems to hijack the car network. They would create a ghost in the machine. A false order, perfectly crafted to mimic the cold, bureaucratic tone of Imperial directives. The content would be a lie, a carefully constructed piece of misdirection designed to pull the enemy's teeth before they could bite. The risk was staggering. Car justice was immediate and brutal. If the deception was uncovered, If a single comms officer noticed a glitch in the verification codes, if a commander grew suspicious, the retaliation would be absolute. The regime's doctrine was clear. For acts of sabotage or rebellion, they executed 1/10 of the local population. Hostages, a mathematical punishment to ensure compliance through terror. The people they were trying to save would be murdered because of their actions. Alex voiced this fear aloud, the weight of that potential bloodshed a cold stone in his chest. It was the same calculation he had made his whole life, just on a terrifying new scale. A small risk for a chance of food. A larger risk for a chance of escape. This was the largest risk of all. Mira listened, her gaze fixed on the hologram of the slave pits. "They already execute us for failing quotas," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They work us until we break and then throw us away. This ship, it doesn't belong to them. It was built by us, for us, it's ours." Her words shifted the perspective. This wasn't just about stealing a momentary advantage from a stronger enemy. It was about reclamation. Taking back a piece of what had been stolen from humanity 3 centuries ago. The technology, the hope, the very right to determine their own fate. The moral debate was a luxury they couldn't afford for long. The clock was still ticking. Inaction was a choice, and its outcome was certain doom. The plan, for all its danger, was the only path that offered a sliver of light. It coalesced around a single stark priority: saving as many lives as possible while preserving the ship. They wouldn't fight the car head-on. They would trick them. They would use the enemy's own rigidity, their reliance on protocol and chain of command against them. It was an audacious bluff. A gambit played from a position of profound weakness. They had a broken ship, a handful of frightened people, and an AI that understood networking better than warfare. They were about to challenge an empire with a lie. The success of the entire desperate enterprise hinged on the car believing a fiction transmitted from a ghost ship buried in the sand. Alex gave the command. The order was given not in a shout but in a low, steady voice. The systems hummed in response, beginning the complex, silent work of forgery. The operation was a fragile construct built on precision and nerve. Every second had to count, every movement be deliberate. There was no room for panic, no allowance for hesitation. Alex and Mira were its architects, but it would require the hands of hundreds to build. Below the command deck, a deep mechanical groan echoed through the ship's bones. Argus had prioritized the maneuvering thrusters, diverting emergency power to the least damaged systems. The AI worked with cold efficiency, rerouting conduits, bypassing shattered relay nodes. The goal was not flight, not yet. It was movement. A slow, painful shift of mass, enough to break the ship's centuries-long embrace with the desert rock. A vibration, low and constant, began to hum through the deck plates. Their most daunting task lay outside the metal walls. Alex and Mira had to go back into the pit. They had to assemble a rescue force from the very people they had fled with hours before. These were not soldiers. They were miners, laborers. Their spirits were worn thin by years of fear and exhaustion. Their immediate instinct would be to hide, to obey, to make themselves small. Persuading them to risk everything on a mad plan required a different kind of strength. It demanded trust they had no right to ask for. The objective was staggering in its scale. They needed to guide hundreds of men, women, and children out of the open pit and into the hidden mouth of the tunnel, then down to the waiting ship. All without triggering an alarm, all under the noses of the remaining car overseers, who were already on edge after the Hellwalker and the missing patrol. It was a migration of ghosts. The plan was a house of cards built on 2 key actions. First, the calculated isolation of the Invictus. Argus would use the ship's limited power to create a localized sensor dampening field, a bubble of electronic silence to hide their movements from orbital scans. Second, a coordinated diversion. At a precise moment, a controlled overload in a distant thorium processing furnace would create a spectacular but harmless energy flare. It would draw every eye, every sensor in the wrong direction. Alex checked the power readings on a secondary console, his fingers tracing the flickering lines. The numbers were low. The risks were immense. He looked over at Mira, who was reviewing the tunnel schematics Argus had mapped. Her face was set, her jaw tight. He muttered the words, not to her but to himself, a quiet oath in the hum of the ship. No more humans will die in those mines, it was a promise. A line in the sand. Their strategy was a blend of misdirection, stolen moments, and brutal calculation. They would use the car's own routines against them, moving in the shadows they created. They would rely on the discipline these people had learned not from drill instructors, but from survival. How to move quietly, how to watch for threats, how to follow orders when your life depends on it. They were betting everything on the quiet courage of the oppressed. Throughout it all, Argus was the silent conductor. The AI analyzed the enemy's comms traffic, monitoring patrol routes and command frequencies, searching for any hint their deception had been discovered. Its primary directive, repeatedly stated, was the preservation of civilian life. Every calculation, every suggested action was filtered through that single, unemotional parameter. The ship was a tool. The people were the priority. This was the pivot point. The moment survival could be twisted into something more. It wasn't just about escaping the pit. It was about snatching a victory from the jaws of the Empire. It was about proving that a group of slaves, armed with nothing but a broken ship and a desperate plan, could strike back. A deep, resonating shudder ran through the Invictus. From somewhere far below, a sound like a hammer striking a mountainside echoed through the chambers. The first thruster test, a cloud of ancient dust and rust shook loose from the ceiling, sifting down like fine gray snow in the blue-lit command center. The ship was stirring. The clock was still ticking, but now they were finally answering. The deep thrum of the thrusters was a grinding protest. The Invictus was not flying. It was forcing its way upward, an immense weight fighting the planet's pull and 3 centuries of accumulated debris. Patient, arduous work from the engineering systems had achieved the minimum breakout depth. The ship had shoved aside the rock and sand directly above it, creating a fragile chimney to the surface. Now came the real struggle. Centuries of compacted desert fought to keep its prize. The sound was a continuous groaning shudder that vibrated through the entire hull, a chorus of protesting metal and shifting rock. Sand and small stones cascaded down the new shaft, pattering against the outer armor like hail. Alex gripped the command console, his knuckles white. This was not the graceful ascent of a starship. It was a brutal excavation. The risk of a catastrophic collapse was a constant, unspoken pressure in the chamber. Then a sliver of blinding white light cut through the dust-filled shaft. It was a stark alien intrusion after the cool blue glow of the command deck. Another meter. Another groaning heave from the straining thrusters. The slit of light widened, became a jagged window, then a hole. Sunlight, raw and unfiltered, struck the dark alloy of the hull for the first time in 300 years. It was a moment of profound silence inside the ship, broken only by the machinery. They were out. Argus handled the final positioning with a pilot's cold precision. The ship rose slowly, turning its bulk with tiny calculated bursts from its maneuvering thrusters. It settled into place alongside the primary Quar slave transport vessel, a hulking, brutish ship sitting on the landing field. The Invictus, even scarred and ancient, made the car ship look clumsy and primitive by comparison. The visual contrast was a statement in itself. Alex activated the comms panel. He took a steadying breath, pushing down the tremor in his hands. The voice that came over the open Imperial frequency was not his own. It was flat, authoritative, stripped of any identifiable emotion. It was the voice of a car bureaucracy he had heard his entire life. Attention all car personnel. This is a Priority 1 broadcast from Imperial Health Command. He paused, letting the weight of the authority settle over the channel. A Level 4 contagion has been confirmed in Sector 7. Code Bluekin. I repeat, Code Bluekin. The effect was immediate chaos, but it was a controlled, panicked chaos. On the tactical display, the biosignatures of the car ground crews scrambled. Code Bluekin was a ghost story in their own manuals, a hypothetical bioweapon agent with a high fatality rate for their species. The directive he cited, 793, was a real quarantine protocol. It demanded immediate isolation of the sector, cessation of all transport, and a full lockdown. They were trained to obey these orders without question. Confusion and fear were his weapons now. The car were following a script he had written for them. The ancient battlecruiser now hung in the air, a relic returned to a world it never made. Its flight was ungainly, its system screaming under the strain, but it was airborne. It was a symbol of defiance made real. To complete the illusion, to sell the story of a containment breach, Argus activated the secondary systems. Dozens of the neural-tethered defense spheres shot from their hidden ports on the Invictus's hull. They took up stationary positions around both ships, emitting a low, pulsing hum and a shimmering field of energy. To any observer, It looked exactly like a standard Quar biocontainment procedure. It was a perfect, terrifying lie, maintained by technology the car could barely comprehend. The stage was set. The civilians were still down in the tunnels waiting for their moment. The clock was still ticking, but now they had control of the rhythm. Mira moved first. She did not lead with a speech or a promise. She simply motioned to the closest group of civilians huddled in the tunnel mouth and started walking toward the car transport's main cargo ramp. Her silence was a command in itself. They followed. Their movement was not the crisp march of soldiers, but something quieter. It was the ingrained discipline of survival, the ability to move as one under threat, learned from years of keeping in line under the overseer's lash. They were a gray river of ragged clothes and fearful eyes, flowing with a purpose that overwhelmed their terror. Inside the transport, 3 Quar defenders had bunkered down. They had sealed the main hatch, believing the lockdown order was genuine, thinking they were protecting their ship from a phantom plague. They were not prepared for a boarding action. When the external cargo ramp began to lower, activated by a remote signal from the Invictus, their confusion was total. They saw not a car biocontainment team, but a wave of slaves moving toward them with a grim, focused intent. One warrior, younger than the others, broke. He screamed a challenge and charged down the ramp, his energy blade igniting with a sharp crackle. He never reached them. A defense sphere, one of the dozens maintaining the quarantine illusion, detached from its orbit. It shot downward in a blurred streak of dark metal. It did not strike him. It simply pulsed inches from his face. The same blinding white flash from the tunnels. The warrior's charge became a stiff-legged stumble. His weapon clattered on the ramp. He fell beside it, his body rigid, his eyes wide open and unseeing. The display of effortless, non-lethal force froze the other 2 defenders in place. Their will to fight evaporated. Alex was there then, stepping past the paralyzed car. He held a makeshift spear, its shaft a length of broken conduit, its tip a sharpened piece of scrap metal lashed on with frayed cable. It was a pit fighter's weapon, useless against armored troops in open combat, but terrifying in the close, dark confines of a cargo hold. He met the eyes of the remaining car. He did not advance. He simply stood his ground, a barrier between them and the civilians now streaming up the ramp behind him. This was the choice. He could order the spheres to neutralize them, to add 2 more bodies to the pile. But that was a line. It felt like crossing into something else, something the overseers would do. He chose protection. His presence and the silent threat of the orbiting spheres was enough. The 2 cars slowly lowered their weapons. On the bridge, Argus monitored the entire battleground. The AI's voice was a calm counterpoint to the tension. It reported the energy drain on the defense spheres. The complex field maintaining the quarantine illusion was degrading faster than projected. More critically, it had tracked the car reinforcements. They were not fooled for long. A gunship, alerted by the anomalous energy readings, had broken from its patrol pattern. It was accelerating toward their position. Time was collapsing. Argus initiated a controlled retreat protocol. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a logistical command, directing the flow of people with cold efficiency. The civilians moved in groups of 20, shepherded by a handful of others who had found their courage in the chaos. They streamed across the open ground between the 2 ships, their heads down, their pace hurried but not panicked. They funneled up the Invictus's own extended loading ramp, disappearing into the belly of the ancient ship. The cargo hold of the car transport was a vast, cold space, smelling of ozone and packed bodies. It was a stark contrast to the warm, living fear of the people now filling it. This was the point of convergence. The low-tech, desperate courage of people who had nothing left to lose, meeting the high-tech, calculated cunning of a machine that remembered a better world. They were not soldiers winning a battle. They were survivors executing an extraction. One group at a time, they crossed over. The Invictus, for all its damage, was becoming an arc. The last group scrambled up the ramp, their faces pale with exertion and fear. A woman stumbled, and a man behind her caught her arm, pulling her the final few steps into the Invictus. The heavy cargo door began its slow, grinding close. The evacuation was complete. They had done it. Hundreds of lives snatched from the pit. But the air inside the ship was not triumphant. It was thick with the metallic smell of fear sweat and the low sounds of pain. On the command deck, the threat display glowed a warning orange. The Kar gunship Argus had tracked was not just approaching. It had launched a boarding party of its own. 6 armored figures rappelled down onto the transport ship Alex had just left. They moved with professional aggression, clearing the cargo hold with disciplined sweeps. They found their paralyzed comrades first, then began advancing toward the sealed hatch that connected to the Invictus. They carried breaching charges. They were not here to quarantine. They were here to reclaim. Alex watched them on the display. His moment of hesitation was brief. He had no weapons to fire, no soldiers to command. His only tool was the ship itself. He gave the order. The Invictus's maneuvering thrusters fired. A short, hard burst. The ancient battlecruiser, a mountain of metal and history, lurched sideways. Its hull screeched against the transport ships, a sound of tearing metal and shearing bolts. The impact was not an attack. It was a shove. The autopilot engaged, and the Invictus held the transport in a crushing embrace, pinning it, making it a shield between themselves and the advancing Kar gunship. Argus's voice was a calm counterpoint to the violence of the motion. Reinforcements have entered the transport vessel. They are attempting to cut through the primary airlock. Estimated time to breach, 4 minutes. The drama reached its peak not in the explosion, but in a slow, grinding pressure. They were trapped against the very ship they had used for their ruse, using its bulk as their protection. The Kar were meters away, separated only by a buckling metal wall. Then the Invictus's thrusters fired again, this time in reverse. The ship pulled away from the transport, creating a gap. The Kar boarding team, caught mid-breach, was suddenly exposed. The Invictus was moving, however clumsily, out of their immediate reach. A collective breath was held on the command deck. They had escaped the closing fist. The immediate tangible threat was gone. In the silence that followed the thruster burn, the other sounds became clear. They were the sounds the adrenaline had masked. A child crying, the ragged, wet cough of someone with dust-choked lungs, a low moan of pain from a leg bent at a wrong angle. The cost of their escape was being tallied not in ships or weapons, but in human terms. They had their freedom, but it was a bruised and bloody thing. They carried the scars of the pit on their bodies and the deeper, quieter scars of 3 centuries of subjugation in their minds. They were free, but they were not whole. This new community, this fragile alliance of former slaves and a relic warship, was born from shared terror and loss. They were bound together not by loyalty yet, but by the raw, immediate experience of having survived the same fire. They had trusted Alex and Mira with their lives in a moment of ultimate desperation. That trust was a chain, both heavy and necessary. It would be tested. The road ahead was unknown, and their vessel was wounded. Their unity was their only real shield, and it was terrifyingly new. The Invictus turned its scarred hull toward the northern wastes, leaving the Saria mining pits as a fading bruise on the planet's surface. Its engines, strained and faltering, carried a new weight. Not just the mass of the ship, but the collective breath of hundreds of former slaves. They were a human cargo, silent and shell-shocked, huddled in the cargo bays and corridors. The air recyclers labored against the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. This was not a crew. It was a refugee population fleeing in a warship. Their course was set for the Deadlands. It was the only choice. Argus had mapped the magnetic anomalies that wove through that region like furious invisible rivers. They scrambled sensors, played havoc with navigation, and would hide the Invictus's energy signature from orbital patrols. It was a dangerous refuge. The same storms that hid them could tear a ship apart if it strayed too close to an energy surge. The ground was barren, irradiated from ancient conflicts, offering little in the way of shelter or sustenance. It was a place of last resort, a gamble on isolation over confrontation. Alex stood near the main viewport, watching the desert recede. The dust of the pits was still under his nails, ground into the lines of his hands. His body ached from the fall, his shoulder a dull, persistent throb. He became aware of the silence around him, the expectant pressure of stares. People watched him. Their faces were hollow, but their eyes held a question. He was the one who had led them here. The weight of their unspoken trust was heavier than any thorium quota. He turned to face them, his voice rough from dust and disuse. "We've taken the first step," he said, the words carrying in the quiet hum of the ship. "But our journey is just beginning." He didn't offer them grand promises of a new home or a life of ease. That would have been a lie they'd see through instantly. He offered them a harder truth. The Deadlands will hide us, but they won't protect us. Not forever. Shelter was not safety. It was a temporary pause, a chance to breathe and to think. The future was a blank space beyond the next ridge of mountains, and they would have to decide what to fill it with. Survival had been the only goal for so long. Now they had to consider what came after it. Behind them, the desert world shrank to a dull ochre ball. It took with it the memory of the whip, the taste of nutrient paste, the sound of boots on rock. It took 3 centuries of subjugation and erased them from the sky. This was not merely an escape. It was a reclamation. They were taking back their right to choose, to build, to be more than a number in a car ledger. The community forming in the ship's belly was fragile, born from shared terror, but it was a start. It was an identity being forged in the fire of their flight. The Invictus, for all its damage, was more than a vessel. It was their shield against the immediate pursuit. Its armored hull and flickering defenses were their only tangible protection. But it was also their beacon, a symbol of what humanity had once built and could build again. It was a seed of a different future, carrying them toward a dangerous and uncertain horizon. The course was set. The first step was over. The long, hard work of the second was about to begin. The last of the planet's thin atmosphere fell away, replaced by the deep, silent black of space. The ship's vibration smoothed to a steady, distant hum. In the relative quiet of the command deck, the AI's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Admiral Solaris would be proud of what you accomplished today." The words were not programmed flattery. They were a data-driven conclusion, a cold analysis of outcomes versus historical precedent, yet they landed with the weight of a verdict. Alex did not look up from the star chart Argus was projecting. The praise felt like a collar. His actions in the pit, the desperate choices in the tunnels, the gamble with the comms, none of it was for glory. It was a series of necessary moves to keep people breathing, to protect the fragile promise of the ship itself. Heroism was a luxury for Stories. His motives were simpler, grounded in the gritty reality of the mining pits. He saw the faces of the people now crammed into his cargo holds. Their safety was the only metric that mattered. The technology was a tool to that end, nothing more. He was the bloodline of a legend, but his instincts were still those of a slave. He knew how to read a threat, how to calculate risk in terms of immediate survival. The grand strategies of admirals and fleets were abstract concepts, ghosts in a machine. He remained a reluctant leader, uncomfortable with the mantle the AI and the evacuees were trying to place on his shoulders. His authority came from action, not ancestry, but his actions had measurable consequences far beyond the ship's hull. On the tactical display, the ripple effects were already visible. Car patrol patterns were shifting, consolidating, pulling back from the periphery to strengthen core systems. The sudden, inexplicable loss of a slave pit and a transport ship, coupled with the phantom contagion alert, had forced a recalculation. The map of power in the quadrant, static for generations, was being redrawn by a single audacious act of defiance. Down in the crowded mess hall and makeshift barracks, a slower understanding was taking root. The initial shock of escape was wearing off, replaced by a dawning realization. This was not just about a single ship or a successful flight. People gathered in small groups, their voices low. They spoke of the car's confusion, of the advanced systems that had paralyzed soldiers without killing them, of the fact they were now flying on a vessel built by human hands for human purposes. The conversation shifted from mere survival to something else, possibility. The resolution was not a shouted declaration or a victory parade. It was a quiet collective intake of breath. Humanity, for 3 centuries a resource to be managed and spent, could become the architects of its own destiny again. The chain of command that had always ended with a car overseer was broken. They had to build a new one from scratch. The Invictus was the catalyst. It was a tangible symbol of a past where humans were not property, a reminder of what they had been. But it was also a blunt instrument of revolution. Its very existence was a challenge to the established order. Its damaged systems and refugee population were the seeds of a new beginning, however fragile. The ship was both the dream and the means to achieve it, a legacy and a weapon, and its new commander was a man who had never wanted anything more than to be free. The steady hum of the engines was the only sound on the command deck. The adrenaline of the escape had faded, leaving behind a hollow, quiet space. In that stillness, Alex's mind circled back to the moment of choice. He had picked stealth, deception, A lie sent over the comms instead of activated gun batteries. He replayed the percentages Argus had given him. 78%. A high probability of destroying that first car patrol. A clean, immediate victory. He could have eliminated the local threat, shown the strength of the ship, made a statement. But that statement would have been a beacon. Firing those weapons, activating those defenses would have lit up every car sensor array in the system. It would have been a declaration of war from a position of profound weakness. It would have drawn not a patrol but the entire local fleet. Every warship, every bomber, every troop carrier within jump range would have been redirected to their coordinates. The Invictus, damaged and struggling, would have been surrounded, outgunned, and torn apart. They would have died for a moment of defiance, and the ship would have been lost with them. His choice had left the local car presence intact. The overseers were still down there, the structures of control still standing. It felt like a failure, like he had chosen to hide when he should have fought. It felt in the quiet aftermath like the coward's path. The weight of that doubt was a physical pressure in his chest. Leadership, he was learning, was not about the glorious charge. It was often about the inglorious retreat, the choice that preserved your forces for another day, even if it tasted like ash in your mouth. It was about swallowing your pride for the sake of the people depending on you. Argus had said his decision reflected the Admiral's priority: civilian safety. It was a cold comfort. The machine saw the outcome, the math, the successful preservation of life. Alex felt the uncertainty. The what if? What if he had been wrong? What if the deception had failed? The weight of command included this constant, grinding second-guessing. Every choice had to be made with incomplete information, and every outcome, good or bad, had to be carried alone. There was no one to confirm he had chosen right. There was only the consequences, still unfolding. He looked at the main display, at the hundreds of life signs now filling his ship. They were alive. They were free of the pit. That was the only data point that mattered in that moment. The right choices, the ones that truly served the greater good, often felt wrong when you made them. They felt like compromise, like surrender. The validation wouldn't come from a feeling of satisfaction. It would come later in the outcomes he could not yet see. It would come if these people lived to see a better day. That was the gamble. That was the burden. He had chosen the longer, harder path, and now he had to walk it without looking back, trusting that the results would, in time, prove the choice was sound. The immediate threat was gone, but the longer game had just begun. Argus ran another diagnostic. The assessment was sobering, delivered in its flat, unemotional tone. The readouts flashed across the main display, a cascade of red and amber warnings against a sparse field of green. The Invictus was a phantom from a golden age, a vessel built with knowledge the car could only dream of stealing. Its systems were elegant, its power source cleaner, its very alloy a molecular recipe lost for centuries. In a straight technological fight, it should have been no contest. But a weapon is only as good as the hand that holds it, and their hand was broken. The ship's main systems operated at 22% of designed capacity. It was a number that sounded almost functional until you saw the details. The primary and secondary weapons arrays were completely offline. Not dormant, shattered. The housing for the main spinal mount cannon showed a catastrophic breach, a wound from the Battle of Zera that had never been healed. Propulsion was a patchwork of emergency reroutes and jury-rigged conduits. They had enough power for slow, clumsy movement, not the lightning-fast maneuvers of a frontline battleship. The ship was a legend, but it was a crippled one. This created a dangerous and unstable asymmetry. The car would look at the Invictus and see two things at once. They would see a prize of unimaginable value, a vessel whose secrets could cement their dominance for another 1,000 years. They would covet it with a desperate, hungry need, but they would also see a threat that defied their understanding, a ghost from a past they had tried to erase. Their response would be a contradiction. They would try to claim the ship while simultaneously working to destroy it. They would want to dissect its technology while ensuring it could never be used against them again. The only advantage they had was psychological. It depended entirely on maintaining an illusion. The car had to believe the Invictus was not just operational, but invincible. They had to fear its potential power so much that they would never risk testing its actual limits. The successful deception at the mining pit had set the stage. The paralyzing spheres, the seamless comms forgery, the sudden, unexplained disappearance. It all painted a picture of a force far beyond their comprehension. The bluff was their primary shield. The emergency repairs on the thrusters were just the beginning. A temporary fix to get them moving. Full system restoration was a task of a different magnitude. It would require specialized parts, refined materials, and power cells that hadn't been manufactured in 300 years. It would need a secure dockyard and a team of engineers who understood systems no one had touched since the fall. They possessed none of these things. They had a damaged ship, a frightened population of former miners, and a single AI whose knowledge was vast, but whose ability to effect physical repairs was limited. They were in possession of a legendary weapon they couldn't yet wield. It was like finding a finely crafted rifle with a shattered firing pin and no ammunition. It could intimidate from a distance, but it couldn't fire. Their immediate survival, and the safety of every soul on board, depended on their ability to keep up the bluff. They had to convince a ruthless empire that they were holding a loaded gun to its head, while secretly scrambling to find even a single bullet. Every move, every communication, every hesitant jump through space was part of that performance. They had to fake strength until they could somehow, against all odds, make it real. The margin for error was zero. Alex's hands knew rock. They knew the feel of a pickaxe handle, the strain in the shoulders from a full day's shift, the exact sound a thorium vein made when it was about to crack. This knowledge had saved them in the tunnels. It was a practical, ground-level understanding of the terrain, forged in darkness and pain. Now that same hard-won experience became their strategic foundation. He knew the enemy not from manuals or briefing hollows, but from a lifetime spent under their boot. He understood the rhythm of car operations from the inside. He knew how the overseers thought. Their laziness, their predictable patrol routes timed to avoid the worst heat of the day, their obsession with quotas over security. He knew which storage sheds were poorly guarded because the contents weren't valuable to the car, only to starving slaves. He remembered the weak points in the perimeter fence, the sections long ago patched with inferior materials. This was not theoretical intelligence. It was a map of habits and vulnerabilities, drawn from thousands of small observed details. This practical knowledge merged with Argus's vast technical capabilities. The AI could infiltrate networks and calculate probabilities, but it lacked context. Alex provided that. He could look at a schematic of the mining complex and point to the unguarded maintenance airlock because he'd seen a crew repairing it last week. He could predict which Quar officer would react to a fake order with blind obedience and which one might question it, based on their reputation for cruelty or cowardice. The ship's cold logic was tempered by his lived experience. Mira stood as his counterweight. Where Alex calculated risk with a miner's caution, she saw opportunity with a desperate boldness. She was the one who had argued for the comms deception, for taking the ship, for leading the evacuation. Her perspective was born from the same oppression, but it expressed itself as action, not just reaction. She balanced his instinct to hide with a push to move. Together they formed a command structure that was entirely new. It wasn't imposed from above. It was forged in the pit. Their leadership drew strength from a deep, intimate understanding of two worlds. They knew the enemy's mind because they had been its instruments. They knew their people's fears and limits because they shared them. This was not the command of a distant admiralty. It was the guidance of those who had endured the same whip, breathed the same dust. They could ask for impossible courage because they had already shown it. The resolution was a quiet truth, observed in the way they worked. The best strategists are not always the ones trained in academies. Sometimes they emerge from the most unexpected places. They are the ones who have learned strategy as a language of survival, who understand pressure because they have lived under it. The Invictus had awoken seeking a bloodline, a connection to its legendary past. But blood was not enough. It had also needed a mind shaped by the present struggle, a leader who could see the enemy's weaknesses because he had been forced to study them every day of his life. It had found not just a descendant but the right commander for the war they were now in. The Invictus leveled off. The groaning strain of the thrusters eased into a steady drone. Below them, the deadlands stretched out, a fractured plain of canyons and jagged rock formations. The view from the main screen was a swirl of dust and unstable energy. The magnetic disturbances that twisted across the landscape were their shield now, a chaotic curtain that scrambled sensors and hid their presence. It was a shelter, but a precarious one. This was not a victory. It was a pause, a moment to breathe. The safety it offered was temporary, a brief gap in the storm. The car still controlled the system. Their ship still patrolled the trade lanes. Their boots still stood on the necks of millions across a dozen worlds. They had saved a few hundred, a single drop in an ocean of suffering. The scale of it was a cold weight in the quiet of the bridge. The ship around him was a symbol of hope. Its very existence was a defiance of the Empire's story. But hope is not a passive thing. It is a catalyst. It demands action to become something real. It requires risk, sacrifice, and a relentless will to turn possibility into change. The Invictus was a tool. It was up to them to decide how to use it. Alex walked away from the viewport. He moved through the ship's central corridor, past the makeshift quarters they had hastily organized. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and recycled air. People looked up as he passed. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, but their eyes held him. They were not the hollow stares of the pit. There was a new light there, a question, a fragile trust. They had followed him into the unknown. They had placed their lives and the lives of their children in his hands. He had gone into the tunnels looking for a way to survive the next hour. He had found a ship, but he had discovered something else. A purpose, a responsibility that went far beyond his own life or Mira's. The voice that had greeted him, that had named him a descendant, had not been a gift. It had been a burden, a chain of duty forged from a history he never knew. It was a debt to the past and a promise to the future, all settled on his shoulders. He stopped at an open doorway. A group of children sat on a blanket sharing a dried fruit bar. One of them, a girl with dusty hair, looked up and gave him a small, tentative smile. It was a simple gesture, a tiny flicker of normalcy in the midst of the impossible. That was what they were fighting for. Not for admirals or legends, but for the chance of a smile. True transformation rarely begins with a grand plan. It starts with a single, impossible choice made in a moment of desperation. It starts with saying no, with taking a step into the dark. Their flight from the pit was over. The journey ahead was longer and far more dangerous. They had the ship. They had each other. They had a cause. The path was uncharted. The odds were terrible and the destination was unknown. The desert world became a dull speck on the screen, its lessons burned into them. It taught that chains are not always made of metal. Strength is not where you expect it. A slave can become a strategist. A broken ship can become a home. The most powerful discovery was not the Invictus sleeping in the sand. It was the purpose it awoke in a man who thought he had none. The voice said, "Welcome back, Admiral." But Alex was already looking forward, not behind. The fight had just begun.